Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most explosive geopolitical mysteries in U.S.-Israeli relations. Seriously, we're unpacking a series of events from the 1980s that read exactly like a Hollywood thriller. But as our sources show, this was all very, very real.
So let's jump right into it. What actually happens when friendly ally nations decide to spy on one another? We're going to start by looking at the central question, because it's exactly what shattered decades of diplomatic trust back in the fall of 1985. We're talking about a wild story involving nuclear triggers, covert front companies, and a massive betrayal that literally no one saw coming.
Section 1. The 1985 Embassy Arrest. A desperate flight. We begin right in the thick of it with a totally frantic scene on the streets of Washington, D.C. The date was November 21st, 1985. Jonathan Jay Pollard, who was a civilian terrorism analyst for the U.S. Navy working at the Naval Antiterrorist Alert Center, was surrounded and arrested by the FBI right outside the Israeli embassy. See, Pollard had utilized his highly sensitive position to deliver vast quantities of classified documents to Israeli intelligence agents in exchange for payment. And in a moment of sheer desperation, as the FBI closed in on him, he actually fled to the embassy trying to seek political asylum. Well, that attempt at asylum completely failed. Pollard was ultimately convicted on several counts of espionage and handed down an incredibly severe sentence, life imprisonment. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Pollard wasn't just some impromptu, spur-of-the-moment recruit. No, sources indicate this fit a much broader pattern of Israeli intelligence gathering in the U.S. In fact, Pollard reportedly claimed that the Mossad had prepared him to infiltrate the U.S. government years before his actual arrest. So this wasn't an accident, it was a deeply embedded operation. Section 2, Breaking the Discrete Arrangement, the Unspoken Rule of Allies. Now, this arrest completely blindsided the intelligence communities of both nations. Why? Because it shattered what was known as the discrete arrangement. Dating way back to the 1950s, the U.S. and Israel had this strict, unspoken pact banning the CIA and Mossad from conducting covert operations against each other. I mean, sure, allies gather intelligence, we all know that, but they generally don't recruit each other's citizens for espionage. Pollard's actions forced a huge public reckoning, proving that this supposedly ironclad arrangement between allies had been decisively and pretty brazenly compromised. Section 3. Lechem and the Spy Master. The broader intelligence web. As investigators started digging deeper, they realized Pollard wasn't just acting alone. He was merely one node in a much larger, highly organized intelligence network operating right there in the United States. Enter Lechem, also known as the Bureau of Scientific Relations. This was a secret Israeli intelligence agency specifically tasked with collecting technical and scientific data from both open and covert sources. At the time of Pollard's activity, Lechem was actually the agency directing his efforts, spearheaded by a man known as the Master Spy, Rafi Eitan. It revealed a systemic pattern of information gathering that went way, way beyond just naval documents. Moving on to Section 4, Smuggling Nuclear Triggers, Project Pinto. Because at the exact same time Pollard was arrested in D.C., there was another crisis linked directly to Lechem quietly unfolding out in California. To understand this parallel plot, we first have to understand the technology they were after, the Krytron. It's a highly restricted, high-speed electronic switch. And why is it so restricted? Because it's absolutely essential for the precise timing required in nuclear detonation systems. We are not talking about standard military gear here. This is literally the key to building a nuclear weapon. Now, looking at these declassified FBI counterintelligence debriefings, we learn about a U.S. aerospace engineer named Richard Kelly Smith. He was indicted in May of 1985 for smuggling about 800 of these highly restricted Krytrons straight to Israel. The details of this operation, which was codenamed Project Pinto, are just staggering. Smith incorporated a company called Milco to serve as a front. Between 1980 and 1982, he smuggled roughly 800 Krytrons, completely bypassing U.S. State Department export licenses by falsely labeling the devices on the shipping manifests to evade customs. When the FBI finally closed in on Project Pinto in 1985, Smith fled the country right before his trial. He was facing a possible 105 years in prison. He ended up living as a fugitive until he was finally captured in Spain 16 years later. And after dodging that massive century-long sentence, he was eventually extradited and sentenced to just 40 months in prison. Section 5. The Hollywood Connection. Covert Operations in Plain Sight. But who exactly was Smith sending these nuclear triggers to? Well, the most shocking revelation of the Milco smuggling ring was the identity of the man pulling the strings on behalf of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Arnon Milchan lived an incredibly wild dual life. On one hand, he's a mega producer of huge Hollywood blockbusters, like Once Upon a Time in America. But on the other hand, he's an active LACAM agent, operating 30 covert front companies across 17 different countries. He owned Healy Trading Company, which was the firm that actually received the Krytrons from Smith. Milchan utilized his glamorous Hollywood lifestyle as the absolute perfect cover for his real job, acquiring restricted technology. For years, all of this was just a rumor. But decades later, Milchan actually went on Israeli television and admitted the whole shebang. He said, and I quote, "Do you know what it's like to be a 20-something kid whose country let him be James Bond? That's action. It's exciting." He completely confirmed his undercover role in acquiring technology for Israel's defense and nuclear programs. It's just wild to hear him admit it so openly. And this network's connections went all the way to the highest levels of leadership. Declassified FBI counterintelligence files reveal that a young Benjamin Netanyahu actually worked inside this specific node of the network. During his time at Healy Trading Company, Netanyahu regularly met with the smuggler, Richard Kelly Smith, over in Tel Aviv. Section 6. Fallout and Official Recognition. The Domino Effect. The simultaneous exposure of Jonathan Pollard in D.C. and the Milchan-Smith smuggling ring in California created an absolute diplomatic nightmare that took decades to untangle. Initially, the reaction was pure damage control. The Israeli government vehemently denied state sponsorship, claiming Pollard's operation was just an unauthorized deviation from policy. Similarly, those massive shipments of nuclear triggers, dismissed as a simple mistake by Milco. Smith was quickly issued a burn notice by the Ministry of Defense, basically abandoning him. Meanwhile, the U.S. had to scramble to implement much stricter export controls on dual-use technology. But, the truth couldn't stay buried forever. The undeniable evidence forced some monumental changes. Following the arrest and the exposure of the nuclear trigger smuggling ring, the Israeli government officially disbanded LACAM entirely in 1987, transferring its functions over to the Director of Security of the Defense Establishment. Then, in 1998, after over a decade of calling him a rogue actor, Israel officially admitted responsibility for the Pollard case. And finally, in 2010, Prime Minister Netanyahu officially acknowledged that Jonathan Pollard had indeed acted as an authorized Israeli agent all along. Which brings us to our final question. How does the legacy of friendly espionage reshape our modern understanding of global alliances? As we have unpacked the legacy of the LACAM Agency, Project Pinto, and Jonathan Pollard, we're really left to wonder, when the stakes are national survival and technological supremacy, just how much covert action is deemed acceptable between friends. It's a fascinating look at the shadows cast even by the strongest of alliances. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this journey for the sources has helped you grasp this incredibly complex piece of history. Catch you next time.